So I do a lot of work around the country and even some international work trying to help behavioral health treatment systems shift into a more recovery-focused, client-centered way of delivering services, and in capturing that within the context of either written or paper treatment plans, right? But one of the biggest dilemmas that we encounter in the field is that I may spend a day, 6 months, 2 years, like working intensively with an agency or a team of practitioners, and they embrace client-centered work in their hearts. They develop fantastic skills around the documentation of that to really capture it in the plan. But then they go back and they try to force that way of thinking and documenting into an electronic health record or a paper template that is all about the problems, the diagnoses, compliance, et cetera. And so it becomes really hard for practitioners to get credit for the good client-centered work they're doing. So I actually do quite a bit of work with systems, unfortunately, usually after the fact, after they purchase an off-the-shelf EHR product, only to then find out it's really not structured in a way to facilitate strengths-based client-centered work. So that's why what you're doing here in the HHP partnership with the adoption of Welligent is really so exciting to me because it's front-end development, thinking about the clinical use, the recovery focus on the front end. Because if you're going to put effort into, as I know you already have been and will continue to after these trainings, really enhancing your client-centered skills, you want to be able to use an electronic health record that's going to facilitate that and not get in the way of it. And I feel very confident. There's always bumps in the road with transitions like this. I'm not Pollyanna-ish. But in terms of the alignment, in terms of you all being given a tool that's going to really support this way of thinking, I think you're in great shape, and it's super exciting, okay? So, good morning. Do you folks sign in?
Yes.
Yeah? Okay. The slides are coming electronically, just as an FYI. So let me just tell you a little bit about me and how I kind of landed up here. I'm a clinical psychologist by training. I am at this program in academia at the Yale Department of Psychiatry in Connecticut. Been there about 20 years or so now, but I always kind of tell folks in my introductions that I do not sit in an ivory tower down in New Haven doing research with my nose in a book or a computer. I consider myself a clinician at heart, and 95% of my work is out in the field in state hospitals, homeless shelters, community support programs, you name it. I'm really dedicating my career to trying to figure out, we have all these terms around recovery and strengths-based and client-centered, and they sort of are like mom and apple pie in a lot of ways. They kind of make sense in our hearts. But translating that into practice and different ways of doing business isn't always entirely clear. And the recovery movement, if you will, has been very big on, I think, abstract and philosophy, which is an important part of the picture. But in my experience, clinicians want to work this way, staff want to support people this way, but they want some teeth, some guidance. Like, if I'm going to sit down and facilitate this planning process with this kid and this family, or with this service recipient, what should I do more of, less of, differently? And what does that look like? And that's really the gap that I've been trying to fill in my career. And we do that in lots of different ways. Have had a bunch of, certainly we try to do data-informed, research-informed work. So we've had a number of different randomized trials through the years, putting some evidence behind this kind of work. But really, I probably shouldn't say this, but I'm outside the halls of the Yale Med School, but where most of my learning comes from is doing stuff like this, is like actually getting out in the field anecdotally and hearing from people, yes, we have a research base, but how is that going to work or not work in the field, in your day-to-day, very messy service settings? So I've been fortunate enough to do that a couple dozen states now, and I will often bring teaching to them, but I'm always learning as I go through my travels, and I'm sure that will happen here in Rhode Island as well. And the other thing I just want to point out, for anybody in the room in like the QM department or wear kind of a compliance accreditation hat? Anybody out there? Okay. So another huge barrier to person-centered planning and recovery-focused ways of thinking is folks often get caught in this trap like, can we create a plan that honors the person but still satisfies the chart? And the state auditors and Medicaid and JACO and CARF and, you answer to a lot of different masters. Please be reassured that I'm very much aware of that tension from my own clinical work and supervision and also from my consultation. And so this is a model that we're going to present in this initiative that does not throw the baby out with the bathwater. There's nothing about this model that should compromise your ability to meet your different compliance expectations, to really satisfy that golden thread of medical necessity that's so important in the reimbursement of your services. And in fact, about 18 months or so ago, CMS, Medicaid, who's increasingly not only encouraging but requiring person-centered planning, they don't give a lot of guidance on what that is, but nonetheless, by policy, they're requiring it. They pulled together, they typically have these state-operated technical assistance calls where they pull together the Medicaid directors from all of the states. And so they offered a webinar on sort of the nuts and bolts of good person-centered documentation that's both person-centered but clinically rigorous. And they actually invited me to do that. And I worked very closely with them in developing that webinar and had lots of conversations around the consistency of this method of documentation with the compliance expectations. And it was very well received. And I tell you that really just, again, to reassure you, I'm not oblivious to those concerns. And again, we kind of continuously take that into consideration. So that's a little bit about my background. A technical issue, just for you all to be aware of. I am deaf and have tinnitus on my right side because of some health issues. It makes it very difficult for me to track where sound comes from. This is a big room with a lot of people in it, and I like to have a lot of interactivity. So you're free to shout out, but if you wouldn't mind, please raise your hand when you do that, because I won't know where it's coming from, and it gets really tough for me. And know that I'm not ignoring you. I can't figure out where you are, okay? All right. Let me see here. Jim gave us a little bit kind of about the introduction, just quick, sort of big scope of the agenda. We're going to talk about a range of things today. I'm going to get you talking with each other about a range of things today. We have quite a mixed audience here. We have mixed representation from agencies, but we also have mixed representation in terms of many of you I know deliver services and supports. Some of you may be in security, you may be in the financial department, you may be in reception, you name it. That was a very intentional decision of the leadership to try to open this overview to as many people as possible. Because even though this focuses on service planning and recovery planning, it really has to be embedded in these ongoing broader organizational shifts around recovery culture, which is every bit about, as much about how somebody gets greeted at the front door, what your environment looks like, your facilities, as it is about the actual transactions in a service planning process. So just a heads up around that. For some of you, some of the information, it may be too rudimentary, it may be too basic. We're going to get going, and trust me, we will be ramping that up and getting into the nuts and bolts of service planning. For others of you, the parts of it that are very specific to service planning, they may not be directly relevant to your role, and I understand that. But again, I think it's a smart decision that we want, at least with these overviews, everybody to have the same basic level of awareness that there's something pretty big going on with how you all are doing recovery planning. And there's going to be some shifts. People you serve may have questions, colleagues may have questions. It may have implications for everything from brochures to your electronic health record, like we're saying. So it's just good to get everybody on the same page, okay? So I'm going to build in a bunch of different opportunities just to get you kind of thinking about this and talking to each other. And we're going to start with one of those in a minute. But any burning questions before we get going about that introduction? Anything Jim said? Anything that I mentioned that we need to kind of clear off the plate so you're not distracted by it? Everybody? Was there one up in the back? Everybody have a piece of paper? Did the things make their way back? Yes, we're good? Okay. So here's the first thing I just want you to do. This will be helpful for me. I just want you to imagine that you're out to dinner last night with a group of friends. You tell them you got to head home. You've got this person-centered recovery planning training tomorrow. And they say it sounds kind of interesting. So what exactly is person-centered planning? Okay. I just want you to think for a couple minutes on your own. I just want you to write down on that little piece of paper or that index card just a phrase, one sentence, it could even be one word. What is person-centered planning and how is it different? What does that conjure up for you? What does it mean to you? There's no wrong answers here. Just write down what comes off the top of your head, okay? So just do that for a minute. After you've written down even just one word or a quick sentence, all I want you to do is a partner right next to you, behind you. I just want you to compare notes. Just talk to each other for, again, one quick minute here, just about what you think about when you think about person-centered planning. My big soccer coach, mom of teenagers voice to get you all to come on back, okay? So again, just raise your hand. Just a couple of volunteers. What words come to mind? How is it different? What characterizes it? Wow, relationship, respect, empathy, and awareness. Yeah, love it. And acceptance. Love it. Terrific. Great. Yeah, people often forget. We often want to jump right to the documentation, and we'll get there. Today, we're going to preview that in this initiative, but fundamentally, the plan is only as good as the relationship it's based on. Yeah. What else? Yes?
Is the plan or goals created by that individual specifically, and what's different is that it's strength-based?
Yeah, so it's different in the sense that it's strengths-based. We really try to maximize the self-direction. The goals we try to draw directly from the individual, the adult, or the family, or the kiddo, right?
We're here to help you have the life you want.
Yep. We're here to help you have the life you want. Maybe not the life that we think you should have, right? I saw the wink there. Yep. Good, good. Yeah, nice distinction. What else? How about this side? A couple more. Who contributes to person-centered planning? How might it be different that way? Who's involved? Yeah, so it's much more collaborative. Who else might be involved?
I think the individual dictates their road to recovery.
Yeah, so individual is dictating their road to recovery. We'll come back to that within reason, because you're still important too, as a practitioner.
Begin where the client is at.
Yeah, so begin where the person is at, where the client is at. We're going to talk about that because that actually has relevance even for your documentation as well as your relationship. Good. How about who else is involved? Is it just the client or? Yeah, so more focus on the inclusion of those natural supporters, whether it's family, whether On the kids side, it might be more the collaboration, obviously, with school-based personnel, could be representatives from a faith community, all at the individual's discretion, of course. Much more focus on the life in the community rather than the life in the treatment system, right? Kind of what you were kind of getting at there. Good. Actually, we're done. We can go home. You guys got it. No, it gives me a sense of sort of where you're starting in the platform. And we know there's been a lot of conversations happening in the system in Rhode Island around recovery for a long time now. So it's good to start with that kind of basic sense, and then we're going to keep sort of drilling down as we go through today's agenda. Okay? All right. I love this cartoon. I found this at like 3 o'clock in the morning. Like, it's so hilarious. It reminds me of being in a car with my teenagers. Still like that. But part of the difficulty that we have in the adoption of person-centered planning is it's really hard to know when you've arrived if you don't know exactly what the destination looks like. Meaning that we have to get pretty concrete, both in process and in documentation. What does the destination look like? What are we going for? What's the vision? Okay, because that really helps us sort of chart the path for how we're going to get there. So I've tried to, just in terms of, especially with these sort of lecture style trainings, I try to mix it up with some video and exercises. Let me just start with the kind of a welcome video that for those of you that may not have been as directly involved in some of the conversations around what is recovery, kind of how do we think about it, how is it different, I just want to start with a quick video that we really like. These are a series of videos that come from one of our big person-centered planning projects. And this first one is a video sort of compilation of a bunch of different people in recovery receiving services. And also, I think there's some staff kind of talking about what is recovery and how is it different, okay?
Having a second chance at life. That's the biggest thing that's stirring all of this is the love that I have in my life today.
The awakening is just realizing your potential of what you could be doing, and the fact that, in my case, that life was worth living, that I could find something to do that was fulfilling.
Recovery now means I can self-direct my own care. I can self-manage, I can better manage my care, and I can have I know how to use my support system more efficiently than I did in the past.
Like, I can look the world in the eye today. I don't look down at my feet when I'm talking to people. I have more confidence because I've achieved things in my life, and I respect myself a lot more. And I'm more daring to try, the fears aren't there to try new things. Because some of the things that I've discovered, by trying new things are stuff that I really like.
It means feeling in control of my life. It makes me feel capable and being an integral part of society in a positive way, being an asset to society.
Feeling like you have someone to love and be loved in return. It seems like a simple thing, but many people through the years have shared with me that that's a huge part of what their recovery is about.
That's me with short hair. All right, hold on. Let me X out of here. So you heard a lot of the same themes repeated in terms of that exercise that you just walked through, but anything in particular stand out for you in what folks were saying on that video? What stood out for you? Yes. Yeah, so the individual need for autonomy. You heard a number of people talk about just that sense of feeling like I have control over my life, that I can self-direct my care and have some input around those decisions that are important to me. Yep. What else? Anything else stand out for you?
Happy or contentness, being content.
Yeah, happiness and being content, right? And that's not necessarily, you heard Michelle talk about just in pursuing goals that she thought would make her happy. Sometimes She achieved them, sometimes she didn't, but she stumbled into stuff along the way that gave her a sense of happiness and fulfillment she may not have found otherwise were it not for pursuing those goals. Yeah. Good. Great. All right. So what you can see here, kind of a theme that we have, really what recovery is about, it's not just what do people who live with a diagnosis want and need. It's really about what do all people want and need when we think about our quality of life, our happiness, etc. So I could share with you a wide range of literature and of research on this topic. There's been a ton of work that has been done about how systems of care look different if they're operating through that strengths-based recovery lens, as opposed to more traditional methods of delivering services, okay? And so there's lots of ways that they're different, and you've picked up on a lot of these already. Historically, we've often valued compliance, compliance with the plan, compliance with treatment recommendations, but there's a lot more focus on the importance of choice now, for example, in a recovery-focused system. And I always encourage people, think about your own experience in healthcare. It's what we demand. I know certainly it's what I demand in my healthcare is some reasonable amount of choice. I don't disregard what my doctors say, but I want some reasonable input around the decision making. Okay, so it's much more of a collaborative, shared decision-making approach. You picked up on the strengths focused. Keep in mind as we go through this, and you'll see this in the documentation. I already kind of alluded to it. Yes, we want to promote self-direction, but that doesn't mean that you're not important. So what you bring to the table in terms of your professional wisdom is still critically important. Yes, we want to maximize and kind of tap into those strengths. It doesn't mean that we sugarcoat and swipe things under the rug that are important barriers and needs that might be in need of attention. So it's very much a model that is based on a balance between those elements, okay? So the best way I have always found to really teach this is, again, through another quick exercise that people usually get a lot out of. So you're going to have a pen ready. But the first question that I want to ask you is think about how have we traditionally defined improvement for people who are living with serious mental illness, addiction, emotional disturbance? What are the classic markers of improvement? What do we value and what do we look for traditionally? I'm giving you permission to take your recovery hats off. That's what I'm doing here. So what are those traditional markers?
Fewer symptoms.
Yeah, so less symptoms or no symptoms. And if you have less symptoms, you don't go where? Maybe you stay out of the hospital or you stay out of jail, off the streets.
Improved relationships.
Yeah, maybe improved relationships. What else?
Medication
Compliance of all, ding, 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 all shapes and sizes. With your meds, with the plan, with the recommendations. Yep. How about how people think about their illness or their addiction? Historically, we want them to what? Have improved insight or acceptance, right? Admission, less denial, if you will. How about the way people physically present? Hygiene. So we're looking at improved hygiene, things of that nature. Okay? All right. Hold those in the back of your head for just a minute. Now what I want you to do, forget your role in Horizon Health Partners or as a practitioner. Just think about yourself personally. And I want you to spontaneously write down what are the 3 most important things in your own life personally. The 3 things that give your life meaning, put a smile on your face, get you out of bed in the morning. Whatever it is, 3 most important things.
Health.
Okay. Be forewarned that someone else is going to see this list in case there's anything private on them. I've learned through the years to let people know that. 3 important things personally. I know it's hard to pick 3, but just 3. Okay, here's what I want you to do. Once you have 3 things on your list, I want you to swap your list with a partner. So give your list to someone else. Keep track of where your list goes. So swap a list with someone. Okay. All right. Part number 2. Once you are in possession of someone else's list, I want you to randomly cross one thing off that list. Do not consult with the owner and give it back. It's all right. All right. Come on back for a minute. Just get your attention here. It's good to see y'all have some fun with that. It's a little bit can't believe you crossed that off. So my first question for some volunteers, what are the kinds of things that end up on your personal list of top 3? Family. Relationships. Health. Home, building your nest. Hygiene over here. What else? Faith, your sense of spirituality, however that feels for you, right? How about any work fulfillment? Yep. Career, giving back, work, volunteering, whatever it might be.
Simply love.
Love. Just simply love, right? To love and be loved. How about happiness? Yeah. How about recovery? Yeah. How about any furry or feathered friends? They're in family. I always say mine are in the family category. What about like hobbies? What do you all do for fun? Any hobbies on that? Running. Exercise. Creativity. Arts. What's over there? Flea markets. Lady after a good bargain over there, right? Yeah. It could be travel. It could be music. It could be nature. Any of those things. Okay? Money. Financial sense of security. That sense you provide for yourself, your family, right? All right. So you may see where I'm going with this, but if you look up here, when I asked you what we traditionally value kind of as outcomes for people who live with behavioral health conditions, we got a list that sounded an awful lot like the list on the left. Okay? But then when I asked you to think about what does quality in your own life mean, what gives your life meaning, what's important to you, we got a list that looks a lot like this list on the right. What do you think? Are those the same lists? How are they different? What do you think?
Autonomy versus obedience.
Yeah. So autonomy on the right, like what we value in our own guts, versus obedience maybe to a system set of standards. Yeah.
The list on the left is for people who are not mentally well and are having exhibiting symptoms of deviant behavior that make doing the other thing kind of difficult because of the stigma associated to the behavior.
Yep. So that left-hand side of the list, couple thoughts in there I think that I'm hearing. So that left-hand side of the list, there's a tremendous amount of stigma around folks who are actively struggling with these kinds of things, and that's very much true. The other thought in there is that It can be difficult to experience the things on the right when you're struggling with the things on the left, right? But does anybody have a different way of thinking about that? Because I will sometimes hear, it's a little different from what you're saying, but sometimes folks will say, well, they're both important, but first you got to get your ducks in a row on the left before you can enjoy the things on the right.
I think sometimes if you start on the right, like having a home start that can help somebody that.
Yeah. Yeah, that's what I wanted you to be really thinking about critically. That sometimes, there's no doubt, by the way, that better management around these things can make somebody's life better. We're not suggesting that all these things on the left-hand side are bad. Let me just say that flat out. But it's really important to recognize that for a lot of people, you have to have these things in your life, and you have to have hope around these things in your life, whether it's faith or human connection or a home of your own. Sometimes you have to have hope around these things to be motivated enough to work on that hard stuff on the left. So that might be another way how they go together. Okay? How about just emotionally in your gut? Like, imagine you wake up every single day and the best that you have to look forward to is all that stuff on the left. What does that feel like for you? Overwhelming, stuck, dull. Yeah, too much, a ton of hard work.
It's also on the left, it's behavior, more
Yep.
behavior and outward
Yep.
symptoms.
Yeah.
Whereas the stuff on the right, we all talked about, all that is coming from our
Yep.
emotional place and heart.
Yep.
kind of stuff.
And we're going to have that much more of that deeper connection to the stuff on the right.
And traditionally, even like you're trying to get authorizations from an insurance company, you gotta use that lingo, or
Yep.
they don't understand it. But
Yep.
that's what where we're heading, and where the client wants to go is what they want.
Yeah, understood. So you actually raised an important point. I was kind of alluding to this in my kind of introduction, which is that, even in traditional symptoms, I don't think most of us go into this business to expect people to be compliant. Like, my goal in life as a psychologist was not to, just have you be compliant. But having said that, I feel a lot of pressure from external sources around the focus on the symptoms, reducing this, the management of that, the compliance, etc. So there's other external factors that pressure us in that direction. There are also attitudinal, internal things that we all sometimes struggle with, myself included. So again, we're not saying that we're throwing the baby out with the bathwater and that some of those things on the left can't be important, but the art in a good, comprehensive, person-centered plan is to give people the support that they need around the things that they're struggling with, but to make sure it is in the purpose of a larger goal that they hold in their heart, that they find motivating, because that's really one of the tricks in this and kind of the key to recovery. We hear that over and over again from folks receiving services. So even just to give you an analogy, to take it a step further, just a couple of volunteers, like, what got crossed off your list? I know this is all hypothetical, but like, just viscerally in your gut, if you didn't have that thing in your life, what would that be like for you? Any volunteers? Yeah.
My purpose in life got crossed off,
Yeah.
and if I didn't have purpose in life, I would be depressed.
Yeah, completely depressed. Yeah, maybe you don't want to get out of bed in the morning. Yeah. What else? Your home. Yeah, pretty scary,
Yeah.
I would imagine.
And like if you don't have a home to go home to at night or a place to sleep at night, at least to get up in the morning and start your day, and everything would be automatic.
Yeah, that's actually, a lot of people will say that sometimes, like, one of the three got crossed off, but if you take one of the three out, the others go like right with it, right? Like, so maybe my ability to be a good mom and take care of my kids is in part, it really is based on being able to feel like I provide a home for them, right? So if you cross my home off, then that's jeopardized. Or if you cross my job off, maybe I feel like I can't provide for my family the way that I want to, okay? But think about this for a minute. You have that in your gut sense of like what it would be like. Anybody have their job crossed off? Go ahead. For a little while, that might be okay, right? Maybe not too long. But, think about this analogy here. Like when somebody enters into a treatment planning process, I've been doing this a couple decades now, and I've seen a vast degree of improvement in the collaboration. But I sit in on tons and tons of recovery planning conversations. I do still hear today, we know that job is important to you and that you want to put food on the table for the kids, but you got to focus, and we need to see 90 and 90 before I'll send you to the supported employment program. So in that moment, abstinence and substance use is on the plan, employment is crossed off. Okay? Or someone, like you use the example of your home. Not that long ago, within the last 6 months, I was in a residential group home, and a woman kind of clearly saying, she'd been in and out of the state hospital, group homes her whole life, clearly saying, my whole life I've pretty much lived in an institutional setting. Before I die, I want a key to my own place, right? And the team, and this was a very well-intentioned team, and they had been very supportive of her, but the subtle and sometimes not so subtle message was, we want to support that for you, but we really got to see 6 months of medication compliance before we're going to feel comfortable talking about a supported apartment. So medication compliance on the plan, and the vision around a home of our own kind of off the plan. So again, I'm just trying to sort of put you in the shoes of what that might feel like for someone. It's, again, rarely, if ever, ill-intentioned. I think we have people's best interests at heart, but when we start sort of crossing things off of people's lists in treatment planning, they often can lose their hope and motivation to partner with us and move forward. So the art is in how do we pull these things together, and like with that woman, talk about how can we make sure that you're taking the very best advantage of all the tools we have to offer you in your recovery, including maybe medication, but at the same time not stall you indefinitely. Yeah.
We had a situation just like you said, how, if we're saying yes, we recognize you have a need or desire to have your own home.
Yep.
The concrete steps that we want to work towards to get you to that goal
Yep.
include med management. So how do you,
Yep.
this is a realistic, yes, we want you to have that
Yep.
home, we're going to help you work on that, and one of the steps to get there.
Yeah. That's the beauty of the plan, and breaking it down right into its component parts, and we'll talk about that. Like, so what we would recommend in that kind of a circumstance is that goal, more than any other part of the plan, you want the goal statement to belong to the individual and to speak to them. Get them out of bed, get them moving, right? I think we all feel that way. But then there are places in the plan where you talk turkey about this is what's getting in the way, that's what's getting in the way, how can we help you with that? And here's maybe some short-term objectives so you know that you're moving in the right direction. But I think if people can actually see that we're legit in saying, yeah, we want you to get there, and this is what it might look like, and then having the conversations about where medication management might fit in there. So I think you can do both, is what I'm saying, and the plan is a good opportunity to break that down.
Well, I think that something like that kind of conversation would be an opportunity to find out what is an impediment in the person or ourselves,
Mm-hmm.
and to look at that as an opportunity to break it down to goals that are more reflective of what the person can do, and then try to scaffold them as in a more gradual way
Yeah.
into what we'd like them to try that they're not willing to try at the time.
Yeah, we're gonna talk about that when we get more to the nuts and bolts of the plan. And when you say scaffolding, I immediately start thinking about things like short-term objectives. But just to give you a preview around the importance of the goal statement and a good recovery plan, I always tell people, because the topic that comes up is, well, we don't want to set people up for failure. And what is realistic? What can they do? There's going to be lots of places in your planning process and your documentation to get into that, especially in your short-term objectives. But at the level of the goal, I always tell people, if it speaks to somebody and it's motivating, support people in thinking big. We do more damage by kind of tamping down people's expectations and limiting them than we do by encouraging them to think big. I think what you're talking about is important, but there's going to be other places in the conversation and in the plan where you can reflect that. So I promise we'll kind of talk about what that scaffolding looks like. But for a lot of folks, they want the big life-oriented goal. They want to kind of know where they're going after they do all this hard work with you. Okay? All right, I'm going to move on just because we have a bunch of material to cover this morning. I am going to give you a sort of a mid-morning break. Again, this was really sort of intended to shortcut what could have been a very lengthy conversation and presentation about research and what's been written about recovery, because I do think that this illustrates this, because what we're really talking about is that historically, there's this tendency to think about us versus them. In in-person centered planning, it's fundamentally based on this idea that what folks want out of life is the exact same kinds of things that y'all just wrote down on your list of top 3. So together in this recovery planning initiative, we're trying to figure out how do we weave that all together into one comprehensive plan without neglecting the important stuff that might be getting in the way. I promise you there's a way to do both. I'm going to give you samples as we kind of go through. Okay? So what does all this mean? It means that treatment systems like Horizon Health Partners, they're working really hard, and they've been at it for years, trying to make some of these changes to better support recovery. And if change is coming, and in fact it's already here, how can all of you be a part of it? And I would argue again that that's true whether you're somebody greeting an individual at the front door, you're in building and maintenance, taking care of the environmental space, you're actually doing service planning, okay? So consider today really an invitation, and we want to be hearing from you as we kind of go along about how you all think that you can contribute to this. So a couple of let's start with the bigger picture before we come back to that kind of drilling down to the recovery planning. A lot of this is just based in organizational culture and policy. You've got your appointment with the doctor is at 11:15, but his appointment with you is at 12:15, right? And somebody used the word early on about, there's something about this way of working together that doctor-patient, professional-patient relationships, there should fundamentally be this level of respect. And I think all of us have probably, even in our own healthcare, I know I've experienced respect and I've experienced disrespect. And so sometimes it's bigger than just that individual relationship. It is also about sort of what is the organizational culture and policy. So know that we know you can't all do this on your own as individual practitioners, because it really is really bigger than all of you. This is a phrase that comes out of the HR arena, but it says when you pit a good person against a bad system, the system always wins, okay? So that means that you all have invested time, you're going to continue to invest time like today, in being the best person-centered supporters that you can be. But if you're operating in a system that is fundamentally not person-centered, in policy, in design, in the rules, in the regulations, if there's a level of rigidity and an inability to make some of these changes, it's going to be really hard for you to actualize those skills. So this is kind of a change process that has to happen at multiple levels. And I actually think that the thoughtfulness that's going into the design of the electronic health record is a part of really the leadership here, recognizing that if you're being encouraged to work in this way and they're trying to support it, I think they're doing the very best job they can to get you a tool that's going to help that process, right? So I'll get this to you electronically. I know you folks can't read this in the back with the fine print, but I just didn't want to dive into the nitty-gritty of service planning without sort of calling attention to some of these things in the culture that just set the tone for a person receiving services. We'll do, for example, what we kind of call an environmental scan when we work with agencies or organizations. And before I would ever kind of go sit in a planning meeting, I would just walk through the front door and see what it's like. Like, how do people talk to me? How am I greeted at the front door? What kind of literature do I get? We've had a 20-year conversation in my own hometown about how the clients walk through the metal detectors and the staff do not. What kind of message does that send to people about what we're thinking? And so again, these are all things that we try to be conscious of. Environmental sort of aesthetics and the way that a space is taken care of says a lot to the people you serve. We did a focus group with folks receiving services around this kind of a topic and sort of what stood out to them. And I remember one of the women in that group kind of said to us, like, I knew this organization was different when I came here, and I went into the bathroom, and there was an air freshener, and there was decorations on the wall, and it wasn't that, like, you know, really vibrant sort of sterile lighting, and they even had in the corner, like one of those little toiletry, like kind of when you go to a hotel often, they had them in the corner. And it just gave her sort of a sense of welcoming in the space that it made a huge impression on her. And the building and ground staff were going to really great length to make sure that there's, again, we could talk forever about do you have a staff bathroom versus a client bathroom. That's another conversation too. There can be pros and cons on either side of that. But if you have separate bathrooms, is the bathroom that the service recipients are using, is it also kept up and as cleanly as, you know, clean as the ones that we are using for staff? And again, this woman was saying, I feel like people care about me here for something just in terms of the way the bathroom is taken care of. So they sound like simple things, but just to make us all be conscious of our policies, our space, you know, big picture, whether you're talking about micro involvement at the level of the individual and their plan, but also is that mirrored at the organizational level? Like your organizations, do you all have some sort of, they might call them a consumer advisory committee, a recovery leadership group, patient advocacy group? Is there some kind of like meaningful substantive involvement where you're getting, do you have groups like that? Is that yes? So yes. Some? Okay. Yeah. It's, you know, even the programs that are working the hardest at this, sometimes it gets overlooked. I sometimes work with systems, hospitals, at the invitation of the Department of Justice when hospitals get sued, typically for violation of patient rights. And so we go in, we do some of this person-centered planning work. I was working with this hospital, not to be named, went down for a big retreat with the leadership and planning group, sat down around the table, everybody started. This is their person-centered, patient-centered planning effort to reform the hospital. We ran around the table. Where's the patients? There's no patient representation in the group. So again, it's just, even people who are well-intentioned, it's something we often overlook. So again, just wanted to point that out because these are sort of systemic things that can really set the tone for how you do the work at a micro level. And we talked a little bit about environment. You know, I think all of you probably know this. I think you're probably working on it in your organizations. But the impression it can make on people when the artwork on the walls is culturally diverse, when the people in the hallways that they're interacting with, that they see people who look like them to the extent that we can. All of those things make a huge difference for folks, just in terms of their comfort in the space and their ability to partner with you. Okay? Just similar kinds of thoughts there. All right, let me shift and do a very quick, I'm going to, just so you can plan for your personal needs, thinking probably about 10-20. We'll take a 10-minute break. But let me do some initial kind of setting the stage, drilling it down now. We talk a little bit about how recovery manifests in service user involvement, policy, environment, but obviously really our most targeted function here with the change you're undergoing is really, what does this look like in service planning, okay? So when I talk about person-centered recovery planning, these are basic definitions. You've hit on a lot of these in your introduction. It's a much more collaborative process. It's based on a model of partnership where both the professional practitioners and the person, that lived experience and professional experience kind of come together in the co-creation of this written or electronic service plan that hopefully shapes your work moving forward. Okay? So why are we doing this person-centered stuff and who is on board? Just to give you a sense of the national landscape of this is not just sort of the flavor of the month with your leadership here in Rhode Island. This is really, I would say, a national and international movement that's been getting pushed from the highest levels of the federal government. That includes from the Institute of Medicine. You have actual regulations that are built into the Joint Commission now around patient and family-centered care. Is anybody, who's CARF accredited? Anybody commissioned? Yeah, right. So it's been in CARF standards for 30 years at this point. And even as I had mentioned, Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, there are actual rules and policies now at the federal level that talk about they don't only encourage it, they require it. So if you're a recipient of Home and Community-Based Services Fund, HCBS funds, there is a requirement that there's an expectation that you demonstrate how you are doing collaborative person-centered planning, okay? The help around that has been a little light and thin, but it's getting better and the requirement is there, okay? So if anybody's a data person, just want you to be aware that, a lot of times we say that there's a values-based imperative to doing this, that we do it because it's the right thing to do when we think about how we would want to be treated or a loved one would be treated. There's that value behind delivering person-centered care, but we got hard data now that shows if you work in this way, you get better outcomes for people. This comes out of some of our research at Yale, some of the partnerships we've done with NYU, New York University. We've shown a number of different things. A couple of things, greater engagement in services, so decreased no-show rates, and this was through the National Council. Some of you all are probably members of the National Council of Behavioral Health Care, right? Big multi-site national study on person-centered planning. What they found was that the agencies that were trained in person-centered planning had this improved engagement, less no-show rates, and very, very interesting, given our earlier conversation, increased medication compliance if the agency is trained in person-centered planning, which at first I was like, that's like counterintuitive because we don't focus just on compliance in this, but it actually really makes sense. Why do you think it makes sense? If you're trained in person-centered planning and then the people you serve are using their meds more consistently, why do you think that is?
Troubleshooting with them what barriers are. You're actually having that conversation and trying to figure out ways to solve the problem.
Yeah. You're troubleshooting with them. They're actually directly involved in the conversation and the choice making around their meds. And I don't know about you, but if a doctor tells me something to take and I don't want to be taking it, I'm not finishing that prescription, right? Whereas if I've had that back and forth with my doctor around pros, cons, what do you think, what could we agree on, I'm much more likely to use it effectively. So lots of great data around this, better clinical and recovery outcomes. So by clinical, I mean things like hospitalization, recovery outcomes, home, faith, community presence, fun in the community, all those kinds of things. And on the clinical side of it, we've got some great results that came out of New York around how this decreases crisis-related events like emergency room visits, acute care detox, things of that nature, which, of course, if you think about where the vast majority of our time and money goes in behavioral health, also leads you to money savings. So that's actually what's fascinating about the link between the clinical outcomes and the fiscal outcomes. That evaluation that they've been doing in New York, again, multi-site evaluation, and because they were able to so dramatically reduce the inpatient days and the ER usage, they had a huge fiscal cost savings when they looked at the Medicaid service utilization and costs from people whose agencies were trained in person-centered planning versus those that were not. And again, it goes back to this idea that if people are more sort of proactively engaged on a regular basis in the conversations around their care, they're taking more advantage of what it is you have to offer, whether it's treatment, therapies, medications. It really does seem to really help people take advantage and benefit from those services and to reduce some of those kind of revolving door high cost. And by cost, I mean to the person and to the system in terms of fiscally. So not just recovery savvy, but fiscally savvy, okay? And then this perspective, obviously the most important perspective, these are some of my favorite quotes from people receiving services through the years. about person-centered planning. You keep talking about getting me in the driver's seat when half the time I am not even in the damn car. Right? And this was years ago, actually in a Connecticut system, and I was meeting with one of those consumer advisory councils, and we were talking about the changes that they were trying to make at the agency, and I asked them, well, what has it been like traditionally? And this woman in the group, she's very animated, and she just flat out told me, like, I typically come to the mental health center, and we have a big cafeteria. We got a little group room off the cafeteria with one of those like 12 by 12 windows. And a whole group of people kind of goes behind closed doors, and they have a little meeting. And, when they're done and they're ready to invite me in, they open the door and I kind of go on in. And, if we're being honest with ourselves, I mean, that was a gesture, a step in the right direction. But the most important decisions about that woman's life and her treatment had really probably mostly been made without her, at that point. So this is when she says, I'm not in the driver's seat. I'm not even in the damn car. I'm in the trunk. I get left behind on the curb. And so, I was very young and naive, and she just stopped me in my tracks. She's like, we have a long way to go. So we've made lots of improvements. There's been a lot of progress. I see the good person-centered work happening in the field. I'm sure it's happening here, but we still got a ways to go. So that's a part of what this initiative is all about, okay? So let me end here before we take our morning break. We'll have a little bit of a conversation. I've basically been building the case. Why are we doing this? Why is it important? What do you all think about the value of it? So we're making the case for person-centered planning. But if it's so darn great, why isn't it universally implemented? Okay? Because it's hard. It's really hard, and it's hard for a variety of reasons. Some of those reasons may be more philosophical or attitudinal. Many of them are organizational, technical, and structural, like not having an electronic health record that supports this, or wondering how on earth are we going to do this and survive our Medicaid audit in 3 weeks from now, that kind of a thing, okay? But some of them are also about things that we may sort of carry in our heads and our hearts that we may not even realize are there. So some of the most compassionate, warmest, most dedicated clinicians I have worked with through the years really struggle with this because it's so hard for them because they feel like they want to push what they think is in a person's best interest. And it's so hard when you've sort of been beside somebody in what can often be the trauma of their illness and their recovery, to sort of let folks take the risks they need to take in their recovery. Because as a caregiver, a supporter, whether that's family or a professional, that's a really painful, scary place to be in. Because we're talking life and death sometimes in these situations. So that's sort of a level of discomfort we have to get comfortable sitting with, because people need to take those risks in their recovery. So we'll talk more about that. But a couple I want to highlight that are very common that come up in my travels, and then I'd be curious to hear other barriers, because now we're really talking about what gets in the way. Why is it hard to do this? And I'll be curious to hear if there are other things that you experience here in Rhode Island that I haven't seen elsewhere. This is a really big one. You keep talking about the person being in the driver's seat, but if they're in the driver's seat, where on earth does that leave me? I went to school for 5 years, 10 years, however long. I have all this expertise. Like, where does that leave me? So they're in the driver's seat, but you do not get kicked out of the car. You are right there. There you are, right? You are a co-pilot, right? And in an ideal person-centered planning process, maybe mom and dad are over here, or maybe a preacher from their church that also helps them with their decision-making and with their recovery, okay? So please know two things. This is not a model that assumes that everything that you're doing is bad. Like, there's terrific person-centered work happening day in and day out. We know that. It's also not a model that says that clinical expertise is not important. There's been this kind of buzz through the years about recovery being anti-treatment and anti-clinical. This person-centered planning model is really one that kind of recognizes the duality of both perspectives. that you have incredible experience and wisdom to bring into that equation from your professional experience. Many of you may also have your own lived experience of mental health or addictions or recovery or what have you. But we're always talking about making sure that lives alongside the wisdom of personal and lived experience. So you're very important, you're valued in the process, and you're going to be valued in the documentation. And I'm going to show you examples of that as we move through the morning, okay? So partnering with a person, doesn't require that you always agree either. In fact, I've sometimes recommended you have the dialogue like we keep talking about, and sometimes you get to that place where you have to kind of agree to disagree. A good example of this often comes up around these dialogues around things like medication, right? And this is really all about trying for a moment to sort of step into the other's shoes and get their perspective on it. And so as someone who might be prescribing medications and we're thinking about the benefit of how this could really help reduce distressing symptoms, that's certainly important, but we can't look at that through the lens of our own professional narrow lens. We also have to think about the cost-benefit analysis for the person, right? So if taking a certain medication or a certain dose, if I'm not going to be able to be intimate with my partner, if I'm going to be cognitively dulled and I can't read at night to put my 3-year-old to bed, if I, whatever the range, if I'm going to gain so much weight that it makes me feel horrible about myself, self-esteem, I can't exercise. Some of you had exercise on your list this morning, remember? So everybody's cost-benefit analysis is different, and it's different from what seat you sit in. You don't have to give up your professional recommendation. What we're trying to do here is marry them, and it's really about that mutual respect we kind of keep going back to, okay? Couple other of the big sort of high item, what gets in our way. I hear this a lot in my travels. This recovery stuff is great. Person-centered planning is great. But we're not sure the folks we serve here are ready for it yet. Like, do you know Janice? Like, the people here they were in a day program for 25 years, and they have serious and persistent chronic functional impairments. And to envision them being an active partner in this, we can't see it, okay? So I hear that a lot, like maybe some people are too sick. This recovery stuff is for folks who are clinically stable or well on their way to recovery. And I want to send a very different message. How it manifests in practice when you run a meeting with somebody, when you write a plan, it's going to look different, right? It will look different for somebody who has spent 20 years in a state hospital, and despite all their hard work and your best efforts, maybe they do have chronically disruptive symptoms. Like, that kind of person is not necessarily going to be in a place where they can write out an agenda to their planning meeting, and they can tell you exactly what they want and who they want to involve, and they may not be in a place where they're able to run their own meeting. But is that person still entitled to person-centered practice in the very best, most creative, whatever way you can? Yes. It's just going to look different in practice. So nobody gets ruled out of this. We tend to think of it really as a rights issue. I think to this day, my very best example of this, I was out in Seattle, and I was working with an assertive community treatment team, and they had been talking about a gentleman who had been struggling for a number of decades, actually. And despite all the treatment and his hard work, he had lived with psychosis, and the nature of how his psychosis impacted him, he had a very hard time stringing together like 2 coherent thoughts, let alone kind of sitting down and writing an agenda and saying, this is my long-term goal and this is who can help me. But that team, they did a beautiful thing. They didn't say he's too sick to be a partner in person-centered planning. Gentleman came into the room, we had a small team meeting, and what they did was, just like I gave you note cards, right? They handed him a little stack of note cards and a black Sharpie marker. And they just said to him, Joe, write down the 2 things that are most important to you to focus on right now. And inevitably, he would always come back to his church and his daughter. So what they did was, this was someone they were trying to get into a supportive apartment, moving out of a group home to a supportive apartment. So they worked really hard with Joe to make sure that he was on a bus line or in a neighborhood where he could easily get to Sunday services and he could visit his daughter. So his sort of extent of participation in many ways, it was quote unquote limited to like handing them a couple cards, but that's beautiful person-centered planning right there. So it's totally has to get adapted. Has to get adapted for kids. Where are my kid providers out there, right? Kids don't have the verbal ability or the cognitive ability or the emotional ability sometimes to partner with you in this way. So you get all sorts of creative. You make observations, you see what kind of gets them fired up, and it's okay to make suggestions if the person can't do it on their own. So it applies to everyone, no matter what they struggle with. It's just how you apply it in practice gets adapted. Okay. All right. Last thing before our break. Don't we already do it? This is one that we hear a lot. And I'll just echo what I have said earlier, which is that there's a lot of great stuff that we're doing in treatment systems, in planning. But when you start to dive down into the details, and again, don't worry about this because I'm going to get you actual electronic copies of different sort of quality indicators around both the documentation and the process and things like that. But this is a snapshot of an older version of a tool that we call a person-centered care questionnaire that kind of drills down. So what does it look like in a team meeting or a one-on-one meeting? What might it look like in the documentation? And when you really start to kind of dive down into the details, it is different. For some of you, it may be more different than others. Everybody starts in a different place with this. Some of you may be well on the trail to doing a lot of this stuff already. But when you really ask people about their experience in planning, it's different both in process and in the plan itself. So this is an example I'm going to share with you. Then I'm going to send you to break, I promise. Because again, I think examples often illustrate this. This came out of a consultation we did a number of years ago where an agency kind of called me up and said, we have this gentleman, his name is, we'll call him Mr. Gonzalez, young guy, 31 years old, Puerto Rican, married father of 2 little boys. He was living with bipolar disorder, and when he would get particularly symptomatic and distressed, he would often rely on alcohol to manage some of that distress. And that combination of things led to these pretty volatile blow-ups in the house with mom. And then at one point, that got to the point where he had this big argument with the wife. He laid hands on her, kind of pushed her across the room. She wasn't hurt seriously, thankfully, but that prompted a couple things. A domestic to the cops, on-site evaluation. He went off, ended up being admitted for inpatient, and then discharged back to a CMHC, probably a lot like yours. Third thing it prompted was that his wife was very committed to reconciling, but she made a very clear, this all happened in the presence of the 3 and the 5-year-old, the little boys. She said, I can't anymore, this is my limit. You're not going to see me or the boys and come back here until you get this under control. So she had kind of set her limit. So the team called me up about this guy, and they said, we think he has a lot of potential, but they basically said he won't get with the program. He's refusing to meet with a doctor. He won't come to any of the groups. He's been pretty kind of belligerent. Come help us write a person-centered plan for him. I said, okay, well, I need this story. They told me the story. I said, I also want to see a copy of the current plan that you've developed with Mr. Gonzalez. So this is what the plan looked like that they sent me. Goal, achieve and maintain clinical stability, reduce assaultive behavior, take our meds. How are you going to get there? Attend all your groups, take all your meds as prescribed, complete our anger management program, etc., etc. So basically, the working plan left Mr. Gonzalez feeling like this. I'm here to return your goals. You left them on my recovery plan. Because my goals in life are not take my lithium, increase my insight, reduce my assaults, right? If you had to guess, what do you think his goal in life was? I want my family back. To this day, everybody, I think we all have those experiences in our work that they sit with you. He came into that room. I went down there to facilitate, help sit in the meeting. And he came into the room. This is a very proud Puerto Rican father, married father. He broke down in tears when he talked about how ashamed he was of what had happened in front of the boys and how he wanted to be a good father to the boys and a good husband to his wife, right? So this did not happen overnight, but we had a pretty frank conversation with that team about it's not really surprising to me why he's not working that recovery plan you sent me. Because that's not a recovery plan, that's his marching orders. So let's see if we can back up a little bit, bring these things together. So here's what we came up with, and this is what we'll preview for you, more of the nuts and bolts. He said very clearly, I want to get my family back. I don't ever want my boys to be afraid of me again. Like, it was so clear how deeply he was holding that and how motivating it was going to be for him. So he had a lot of strengths to draw upon. He was a very devoted dad. His wife was involved and supportive. She was open to reconciliation, but with some expectations. He was a devout Catholic, and faith and prayer were very important to him in his life, in his recovery. He had been feeling pretty misunderstood by the team, but he did have a very positive connection to a peer specialist in the program, okay? Now, keep in mind that theme of balance that I was talking about in the morning. At the same time that he had those strengths, we could not neglect the fact he had some very serious issues related to mental health and addictions experiences, including violence, okay? So he had acute symptoms of mania that led to violence in the home. He had a lack of coping strategies to manage distress from the symptoms. So he would tend to abuse alcohol in those situations, which would only further escalate behavioral problems, okay? So what you would historically think of as the problem list that lays your trail of that golden thread of medical necessity for Medicaid, it still lives in a good person-centric plan, but you see how it's living here. It's not dominating the entire plan. A classic plan focused only on compliance from Mr. Gonzalez would have said, problem number 1, assaultive behavior. What's your goal for your assaultive behavior? Problem number 2, your alcoholism. What's your goal for your alcoholism? Problem number 3, your mania. What's your goal? Right? And so you can see how that would get really carved up. Here, we're not losing sight of that, but we're making sure that it lives in the context of a goal that's really important to him, because we're talking about what's getting in the way.
Can I ask a question about?
Yes.
What about if the person doesn't sign off on the barriers? In other words, doesn't agree that you're...
Yeah. Okay, so that's a good question. We're going to come back to that after the break. You can always have, and you're going to see when we give you a sneak peek later of the recovery planning template that you all are going to be working with. It's important in a recovery planning template to have opportunities for both parties to weigh in, especially if you don't see it differently. And you're going to have that opportunity in that new template, okay? Sometimes through the conversation you can get there. What I will tell you, by get there, I mean sort of come to a consensus around it. If not, you can note the divergent perspectives. Here's what you do not do. I've done record reviews and consultations where I read the assessment, and it's like 30 pages of poly substance use and in and out, and I'm getting in criminal activity and going back and forth. And then I get to the plan, and there is nothing about substance use over here. I say, well, wait a minute, did I have the right assessment? Oh, well, he doesn't acknowledge that, so we didn't put it on the plan. No, that's not what I'm saying. This is where we talk about partnership, and your perspective is important too. So whether a person would acknowledge that or not, it's important for you to, have that very frank yet respectful conversation. I'm not doing my job if I'm not also pointing out to you how the use of the alcohol is also contributing to what's going on with your wife, and that's a big part of why you're not in the home right now. So what can we do to work together around that? So yeah, even if they don't acknowledge it, you really have an obligation to acknowledge that, okay? So last but not least, and then I promise I'm going to send you to your break to take care of your needs. Big goal, I want to get back with my family. I want to be a good dad, okay? what's going to be sort of proof that I'm going in the right direction? What they ended up working out was within 30 days, Mr. Gonzalez is going to use some new coping strategies to have positive interactions with wife and kids during one supervised visit in a family therapy session. There's an asterisk next to positive because I can't squeeze everything onto the slides. You would have had a conversation like, what does that mean? It means certainly no physical aggression. Maybe it means tone of voice. Maybe it means no unwanted physical contact. If she's open to a hug, that's okay. Not posturing or intruding on space in a threatening way. You would have defined that a little bit for him. But what happened with this objective was like he's getting a message from his team that he's been heard, and you're going to work with me to see my wife and boys within the next month. Okay, and that's a step in the right direction to get in there. So what happened with that is that he's a lot more likely to maybe show up at your anger management group. He's a lot more likely to have a conversation around how the lithium might take the edge off for him and help him better manage some of these distressing symptoms. So how are you going to help him be successful in this kind of objective? Maybe you've got some of your medication management to reduce irritability and acute mania. Maybe you have a family specialist doing some of the family therapy sessions to provide psycho-ed to the family regarding mental health and recovery. Maybe a rehab specialist is doing coping and communication skills training just to help him manage that distress and have healthy relationships at home. So maybe they're teaching, role-playing, coaching, some of those things. And then, in a good person-centered plan, remember, this is a rehab specialist, this is a family specialist, this is a doc or an APRN. Certainly other roles in here. These are the things that you typically get paid to do because they're your professional services, but in a well-rounded plan, you want to tap into his strengths and think about those natural sources of support. So he had a referral to spiritual counseling to promote the use of faith and daily prayer as kind of a positive coping strategy. And then last but not least, remember that peer specialist that he was connected to? We really wanted to kind of tap into that, and the peer specialist and Mr. Gonzalez agreed that they were going to work together. He's going to develop a RAP plan. So again, rather than just relying on the use of alcohol, like simple, safe, effective stuff that he could do every day to manage this. So I'm going to stop here, but what I want to illustrate for you is hopefully, and we'll have time to talk about this after the break and go into more detail. But by showing you the example, I'm trying to show you and give you some optimism. You can absolutely write a plan that honors the person and satisfies the chart. Like, it can still have teeth, and it can still have medical necessity and meet your accreditation criteria, yet you don't have to lose sight of what's important to the person. It's an art, it takes practice, it may be different, but that's what we're here to work on together. So this is an example of one of those kinds of slides. It's just a nice big picture graphic of a simple mnemonic that we use to remember kind of the key components of person-centered recovery planning. We call them the 4 Ps, okay? Down here, we've been talking a bit about this already. We've actually touched on all of them, but it really starts with the philosophy of recovery, right? So believing that people can and do recover. They can and should, as much as possible, be involved in decisions that impact their lives. This type of philosophy informs often a different kind of an enhanced process before a planning meeting, during a planning meeting, after a planning meeting. When you think about roles and relationships and that type of a thing, coming out of that different kind of process, we hope we end up with an enhanced and maybe a different kind of a plan, which I kind of had previewed for you an example before the break. And before we leave today, we'll do 2 additional full examples, 1 adult and 1 children's. Again, I tried to sort of put a mix of materials in to accommodate everyone, okay? But really the most important P in the model is remembering that we're doing this for a purpose. And that purpose is really getting kind of a broader, more aspirational outcome for the people that we serve. So moving past the surviving, right, and not just staying out of the hospital or juvenile detention, but really thriving, right, in our communities and relationships, etc. thriving, not just surviving, but thriving. Sorry, did I mix up?
No, it's New Rock Company.
Oh, nice. Oh, that's right. I did remember that. That was one of the organizations, right?
No pun intended.
So, this graphic is actually attached to a project that we did in partnership with some folks across the pond at Cambridge, where we developed a very quick 7.5-minute online video that kind of walks through these different 4 Ps and gives an overview of the person-centered planning model. And it has a great set of attached kind of handouts, really nice graphics, pretty user-friendly. And we've had agencies have a lot of success just kind of pulling that into a staff meeting, new employee orientation, just to generate some conversation about the way you're approaching recovery planning. So I just wanted to point that out. You've got kind of an embedded resource there, okay? Just another graphic. I know that some folks can be visual learners and respond more to the visual graphics to illustrate the content, but this just kind of shows you some of the steps that we're talking about, and I'm going to walk through those more concretely now in the time that we have left, okay? So let's talk a little bit about the process, not the documentation. We're shifting gears a little bit. We'll come back to documentation, but the process of recovery planning. So a couple of things, and again, you may be doing a lot of these things already, but hopefully there's some new ideas in here for you as well. So really having a person be kind of a partner in all planning meetings, right? We have to start with that as the basic. I never used to have that in here, but you have to still ask the question because planning meetings and conversations do still happen without people. I understand that's oftentimes not for a lack of effort on your part, but if someone's consistently not showing up, it's kind of challenging ourselves to dig a little deeper and find out, well, why is that? Is it logistical? They don't have kid coverage? Do they not have transportation? Did they feel intimidated last time? Or maybe like their voice wasn't heard? Like, would they feel more comfortable if a peer specialist accompanied them? Like, digging a little deeper, finding out how do we get them in the room to have the conversation, okay? Even something as simple as advance notice, because this happens all the time. I remember from my own clinical work, like, it wasn't that long ago. I had an electronic health record. I would log on in the morning. And it's like the minute I turned my computer on, like all sorts of alarms would go off and steam's coming out the top, and I got 16 alerts about this one's treatment plan is overdue and I can't bill, and that one hasn't been in 60 days and send a no-show letter, and right? And if somebody's treatment plan was overdue, that puts pressure on me as the clinician. I get somebody who doesn't show up, and I've got 20 minutes between appointments, and I see Rosa out in the hallway. I'm like, come on, Rosa, you're overdue. Come on, I got 20 minutes, ready, set, go. Tell me all your deepest hopes, dreams, and desires for your life. Right? And Rosa's kind of like, whoa. And that's a very real example of sort of the interface between pressures you all are under, but also the position that puts Rosa in. One of our peer specialists who's in a lot of the videos you'll see, Kim talks about, it's like the chronic problem of the pop-up meeting. And you have to really think about, if we value the conversation that's happening, whether it's one-on-one or in a team, people need to wrap their heads around it and maybe get prepared. Because of my health issues, I spend a lot of time at doctors nowadays, and sometimes I only get 7-8 minutes of their time. So you darn well better know ahead of time. I got my little note card, and I'm writing down what do I got to get done, what questions do I have, what's important to me. But I am only able to do that because I know when it's happening and I can prepare in advance. So things like that make a difference. Recovery is based on the notion of there being transparency in the partnership, so that people should have access to information, including, let me ask you this, raise your hand high, does everyone pretty much automatically get a copy of their plan? Raise your hand if they get a copy of their plan. They're offered, okay, right? So, and in many cases they may not want it. I hear that. So why don't they, tell me some reasons why they don't want it. They don't care. Is there a reason they may not be invested though? So sometimes it may be, people can be not invested for a variety of reasons. But I think we have to own our part that, you know, if Mr. Gonzalez gets that plan that says, don't slug your wife, take your lithium and do what we tell you to do, he's probably not going to really want a copy of that. but he wanted a copy of the second one. Okay, so that's we often say in all the things that I share with groups and training and consultation, if you're not already automatically offering the copy, just try it once in the next couple weeks, because it will so dramatically change the words we use, how hard we work to frame and integrate what's important to the person. It really makes a big difference. We say that the plan is a manifestation of the partnership. So we really have to ask ourselves if we aren't automatically really trying to make sure they have a copy. Some people don't want the paper copy, and maybe they just say, well, can we sit down and go over it together? Like when I've worked in shelters or residential settings, they don't have private space. I totally get that. So sometimes maybe we'll keep it at the office. I'm more concerned about sort of the direct transparency around the content. So it's like this action of, so we met a couple weeks ago, and your mom had come in, and we had talked about what you want to focus on. I took a stab at writing it up. Let's go over it together. Did I get it right? Does anything not sit right with you? Anything we need to change? Like, what do you think? It's that kind of opportunity of giving the input and the feedback. And by offering them a written copy, back in the day when I was an intern, I won't say how long ago, but legally people have a right to access their records, right? But we're not talking about, like back when I was an intern, you go down into the sub-basement of the mental health center and you go through the tunnel and you find the medical records office in the corner, and then you ask really politely to the lady behind the desk after waiting 15 minutes, and you pay 5 cents per page, and maybe she'll get it to you in the next 30 days. That's like legal access. That's not transparency. It's different. They're different kinds of constructs. So it's really just about sort of acknowledging the content, going over it. Meetings might look a little different. How you prepare the person in recovery might look different. Let me say a couple of things about that. Your meeting dynamics. A lot of this work, and especially the people, I think we have a lot of our child, adolescent family, right? So you probably tend to do more team-based planning, school personnel, with parents. Maybe some of you who work more in adult mental health or addictions, maybe you do your planning one-on-one. Although there's still always benefit in that natural circle of support. But when you're having a team meeting, just being conscious of how the room is set up. I just learned a lot from observing, and I remember being in a hospital setting with an adolescent female, and it was like a very long, narrow table. They had done a great job of getting like family, school representatives, or somebody from her church there that she was very well connected to, the professionals. And they brought the teenager in. There's like 8-10 people around the table, and they sat her at the very tippity top of the table. So all this sea of people down there, and they were very well intentioned in trying to be supportive, but all eyes are on her, like the Grand Inquisition. So they start asking her questions, and guess what she did? Nothing. Not a word, which is probably maybe kind of smart on her part, I don't know. But it was like something about even the spatial dynamics of how that room was set up can make a difference. I've seen, you don't always have control over this, but just being conscious of it. As an acute care setting, and a gentleman who was really, it was respite. He was struggling with acute experience of what some would call psychosis, and very, very worried about other people and experiencing, again, what some would call paranoia. He may not have called it that, but the doctor, to be fair, was trying, they did a lot of concurrent documentation, so he was trying to take notes. So because of the limitations of the space they were using, the team sat around a table, and the doctor sat behind him taking notes into the computer. And it's like you just think about sort of the distress that he's already in psychologically and what the spatial setup of that room did. So I could give you many examples, but environment makes a difference. How the meeting is set up and run makes a difference. This is a big thing, and I am guilty as charged with a lot of these things. Technology is amazing, but it's a huge intrusion on our lives, and it's a huge intrusion on good planning and good teamwork. Because if somebody only has 30 minutes, an hour of the team's time, it's like we really want to think about that as sacred space to do some good planning together. But yet, if we're responding to text messages and alerts on the phone or emergencies, you think about the message that sends to the person, it's just very distracting. And again, in my own staff meetings, our leadership meetings, I think we're all guilty of it, but just kind of recognizing it as sacred space. And not slipping into habits. I've seen this happen in the kid stuff that I've said and a lot, although it happens in general, where a team will be meeting and say there's groups a person's scheduled to go to, and the group leader is there. And then the primary facilitator of the meeting says, I noticed in the log that, Janice isn't going to group and she hasn't been at group, in the last couple of weeks. What's going on? To the group leader. But where's Janice? Right here. So it's not that you don't want to solicit the group leader's perspective, because again, it's partnership, but be conscious of we slip into talking about people in the third person when they're right there in the room with us and just saying hey, what's up? You used to go to that group all the time. Is it not working for you? Do you need a different group? So lots of things to think about. With all the work that you're doing on person-centered planning, I've had this conversation with the leadership, and we'll continue to have it, but we have leaders in the room here of your respective agencies. One of the biggest mistakes systems often make in this process of trying to make these kinds of changes is that they invest a lot of time and energy into training staff to being the best person-centered partners they can be. But guess what? You're only one half of the partnership equation. Who's the other half? Right? So for some people who receive services, getting in the driver's seat and partnering with you, it may be a very kind of natural transition. If we sort of slide on over and give them the keys and co-pilot, they got what they need to be a good advocate, they feel comfortable, they need the invitation. For other people, that may be unbelievably intimidating. They may be very skeptical. They may need some actual skill development education around what's a plan, why should it matter to me, what should I think about ahead of time, who might I involve, if I have a disagreement with my team, what's the best way to handle that. So it's thinking about building competency on the other side of the equation. So the reason I say that is this is a copy of a toolkit. It's kind of dated now, but it's still really useful. We have a version in English and a version in Spanish. And it's a little mini toolkit for people receiving services, all about what is a recovery plan and why should I care? What should I do ahead of time? What should I do during? What should I do after? It's got embedded worksheets that are in it. And again, it's web-based, and we can get you copies of both. This one happened to be designed for an adult system of care, but I would argue that a lot of the materials could readily be adapted. And when you go to get them, if they're in PDF and you need them in Word and you want to use any part of them, you guys can email me through the leadership, okay? So you want to be thinking about these kinds of things. What I will tell you, there are some pretty simple and effective ways to do this. Some simple, some not so simple. How many of your agencies are fortunate enough to employ some peer specialists? So a bunch. Okay. So anybody who's committed to the value and practice of recovery planning can do this kind of education, but the places where we have seen this get the most traction is when you get things like this toolkit into the hands of your peers and have them lead the way. Doing a monthly gathering, integrating it into recovery groups they're already doing. We have teams of peer specialists that they have an office hour system if they're employed part-time. I'm here for 3 hours on this day of the week. If your recovery plan is coming up in the next 30 days, book in half an hour with me and we'll go through this toolkit. And what's been fabulous is that's a great way to activate the person, the individual, the client, before they get in the room. B, I think it's a perfect fit for the talents, usually of your peer specialists. They have a unique ability to do that kind of work. And C, the clinicians who have been involved in that kind of stuff say, we are not starting from scratch when they show up. It's we feel like the groundwork has been laid. Yes, there's still work to do, of course, but a big part of that ball is rolling, so really efficient. It's a nice way to think about distribution across team members. Does anybody do the evidence-based practice of illness management and recovery? It's one of the SAMHSA evidence-based practices. Is that not ringing a bell? Okay, I'll hold that thought. There's a nice way, if you're doing any sort of psychiatric rehabilitation, like skill building type groups, we have seen agencies, because you always have to think about, I get this, you have to think about how do we, that's a great idea, Janice, but productivity, how do we bill for it, et cetera. So for example, we have psych rehab programs in Connecticut that if someone has like communication skills deficit, it's a very concrete skill to teach people how to advocate for themselves and getting their needs met in the healthcare system. So they'll do things like weave in this toolkit in a communication skills psych rehab group, which is linked up with the fact that they have needs in this area. So together those things really help support kind of the justification and medical necessity of delivering that kind of service. So lots of creative ways for how you can use stuff like this, okay? This you may see pieces of throughout this initiative. I've shared some tools from this project. We basically took that paper toolkit I just told you, and we've had a couple of NIH grants where we have created an online training platform, both for staff and for people in recovery, about partnering on person-centered recovery plans. It's a very cool tool. It's not available broadly yet, but it really kind of puts a lot of bells and whistles and different teaching and learning tools for different learning styles in a nice online training package. So you'll probably be seeing some of the tools that we've developed throughout that process in this project. It's called the Recovery Roadmap. Okay. All right, I can never say it better than some of these folks, so I'm going to play a quick video that this is one of a number of our peer specialists actually talking about, we followed agencies through this transformation of, you know, really feeling like they delivered more traditional care, trying to shift to more person-centered planning. And then we talked to people about how did that feel different before and after. So this is just a clip of folks kind of talking about that.
The planning way back was not much of a treatment planning. It was more of me coming to the mental health center and expecting them to be able to fix me.
The treatment plan was essentially a number of prescribed treatments for problems.
I really just wanted to be heard, and I wasn't. I didn't feel that I was totally heard. And I thought that I was going to be a zombie for the rest of my life, you know.
Well, early on, when I first was hospitalized, back then it was just maintaining you, keeping you quiet, and that was it. I mean, there's no idea of recovery or any suggestion that things could be different.
I seen that they didn't have no hope for me, so why would I have any hope for myself? I always had the feeling that the clinicians or the providers or whatever, they were all the way up here, and I was way down here. So I still had that like less than thing going on, and it was very hard for me to trust.
We began this process of trying to turn the paradigm around and create something that was different.
Person-centered planning is about connectedness, you know, feeling connected to something, feeling a part of something.
I'm on the team. My treatment has changed since person-centered because now I am a part of the team, and so I'm involved with the planning of the dates. I'm given a copy of it, so I feel like we're more of a team working towards my goals. Yeah.
Treatment planning involves the client a lot more. We actually have them sitting in the room with us to talk about their recovery and what they want and what their strengths are, and they get to have a say about who they want to be a part of their recovery. We also try and get families to be more involved than before and have the families also sit in on that treatment planning session, and it's more of a dialogue between the treater and the consumer.
They just make me feel supported. And I know that I can do anything, that they want me to do anything that I want to do for myself in my life.
I was able to get a copy of my treatment plan. I was able to remain focused on something, on a goal. I was able to set goals. I was able to go to new heights that I thought I'd never be able to accomplish before.
Like I said, I often feel like I can't say it any better than some of these folks. So it's a good point to pull in some of their words. You hear how a number of them talked about the importance of the copy of the plan? Like when they were really working together in this way and the substance of it was relevant to their life and their recovery, they're like, yeah, I want a copy. Like, you want me to work it? I gotta have a copy. Like Kevin at the end there talks very openly about like, I can work it. Like it keeps me focused. I know where I'm supposed to be at this point. And if I'm not getting there, then I talk with my team about why not. So people make a difference. When the process shifts, it makes a big, big difference to people. And they will notice it. You'll hear people say things like that. So I'm going to pick up here. Because... Why am I... Oh, hold on here, folks. I'm just having a PowerPoint issue. I want to shift, and I want to talk a little bit about language. And again, I think language is one of those things that will be relevant no matter what your role is in the organization. And... we've made a tremendous amount of progress in being more cognizant of our language choices. And I will tell you that, I think I said in my introduction, so I'm a clinical psychologist, and I'll be the first one to tell you that when I got out of grad school, it was like I was programmed. Every summary that I wrote, every assessment I wrote, like, patient is a chronic 43-year-old schizophrenic with a long history of medication noncompliance, which has led to multiple hospitalizations, institutionalization, et cetera, et cetera. And I fancied myself a really person-centered practitioner. And I think I carried it in my heart, but I had these habits in my language that was how I started the narratives. And they often flowed like that. And then what we have to ask ourselves is, if that's the kind of language that we use to capture a person's life and their story, it's really hard to back your way out of that into a good strengths-based, person-centered plan. So we just have some shortcuts and bad habits in our language, typically. I've been guilty of this myself. I think part of how these words on the left landed over here, so on the left we have very common words in language that get used verbally and in treatment plans, which are, for lack of a better term, pretty deficit-based and could be offensive to people reading their records or being spoken about in this way. And again, some of these have landed on this list because in my own staff meetings, my team members have said, oh, hey, Janice, that's not walking the walk, that's talking the talk. Like, what did you just say? And I'm like, you know what, you're right. So it's a work in progress. Nobody's trying to be the language police with this exercise. We're just trying to sensitize all of us to the choices that we often use, sometimes inadvertently. So it's hard to see in the back, but let me just pick a couple of these. And what I want you to think about with me is what might be the issue with how the word is written and the message it communicates, and what might we say differently, okay, or how might we reframe that? So let's just start with the classic one. The patient is a schizophrenic or a borderline. So that, hopefully most folks are familiar with that. What's the issue with that?
Label.
Yeah, so it's a label and you're identifying them as their quote unquote diagnosis. Okay, so it's not person first language. So what are some options? How else might we describe that? Person living with, right? Experiencing, currently has a diagnosis of, okay? All right, so start with those kinds of basics, and then even just think about how many of you have ever been called a case manager at some point in your career? Me. Right? There's this great article, it was a published article back in the 80s, written from the perspective of service users. I'm not a case and you are not my manager. And so even just people kind of, the hierarchy and the most common like job title in America in behavioral health, right? So what are some creative sort of staff titles that you use in your organizations that might capture a sort of a case management function? Advocate. Nice. Other things? Recovery coordinator, recovery coach, right? We've had care navigator, like somebody who's helping you kind of navigate the system. Good. Even this one. This is on the list because I was in an elevator like 10 years ago. I did this exercise with a mixed group of people receiving services and staff. And a person receiving services grabbed me in the elevator. They're like, what is this? They're always talking about frontline. Like frontline, I think it's the staff. Like, and basically kind of saying like, where's the war and who is fighting who? Kind of a thing. And really kind of talked about like, is it that hard to be beside me in my recovery that it feels like a war? It was really uncomfortable for this person, right? That's one you've all heard. I hear it still in the systems I'm a part of. But same kind of thing, like recovery coach, care coordinator, defaulting to, even if you say, the person has such and such, they're suffering from. Patient is suffering from, they're suffering from. So what's the issue with that, to use that universally? It tells them they're suffering. Are all the people 100% that you serve always suffering all the time? No. They're managing, they're working to recover from, they're overcoming, they're thriving. Temporary challenge, right? So it's not that these words on the left-hand side of the list are always inappropriate. It's just they tend to be universal defaults in the way that we use verbal and written language. So I'm just trying to get you to think with me about them. If I have someone, like when I used to work in the front area, acute kind of intake, if somebody comes into me and sits down at my desk and breaks down in tears and says, you have got to help me. I have a voice in my head telling me to jump off the roof of my apartment building. It's tormenting me. I'm suffering. I'm not going to say, well, back up now, because suffering is not really a label that we like to use. Like, in that moment, you honor that person's experience because they are suffering. So just know these are not universal. These are just, I'm trying to tickle your thinking here. We talked a little bit about this one. Comes up all the time in recovery planning. We want to support them, but that person has an unrealistic goal. The what? Unobtainable. Yeah, or I might call it's unobtainable or it's unrealistic. What's the issue with classifying a goal like that? Go ahead.
We have no idea whether it's realistic.
Yeah, you got a crystal ball in your pocket?
Yeah. We got a guy who's in the movies now.
Yes.
That was his goal. He's got an IMDb.
Yeah, you hear those stories all the time. Yeah, so other thoughts on that? Instead of calling goal unrealistic, what might we say?
I have a client right now that has constant delusions.
Mm-hmm.
Thinks his father's buying new cars all the time.
Yep.
And he doesn't have the ability right now to drive or at this time that goal is unrealistic. I don't know in the future, but at this time, for me to say, all right, let's go get your money and go get you a car, this isn't the responsible thing to try to do.
But this might be where we talk about what came up in the introduction, that if somebody is, particularly motivated about driving, but maybe they have to start somewhere with a much smaller step. If the driving goal is on the plan, you may actually get them to take that first step. I would even argue that this goes so far, some of you may disagree with me, and that's fine, but I think this is even true when you're working with someone who may have alternative perceptions or delusions. Like in the residential setting, we've had He had a gentleman who, for years, he was really struggling. He had a sort of fixed idea that he was a platinum recording star and that the residential leaders of the program had been stealing his royalty checks. And so, like, he would routinely call the police to come to arrest him, and he'd end up in the hospital. It was not a good situation. But underneath that dynamic, this was actually a gentleman who was a very accomplished musician. And at one point in his life had been very tapped into that, and he had actually performed on Broadway. So maybe he's not going to be a record platinum artist, but you could build that recovery plan somehow around his love of music. So some people might say, oh, well, that's colluding with his delusion. Well, no, even delusions have power to people, and they have meaning. So it's, you know, again, just keep in mind the point of the goal is not for us to judge whether it's realistic or unrealistic. You have other places in your planning process that you can do, and you have pressure to do that, to drill down into those concrete, realistic, smart objectives. But I would argue the goal is not the place to do it. Instead of saying it's an unrealistic goal, what could you say the person has? They have what? High hopes. I like it. High expectations. They're aspirational. Any of those kinds of things. I mean, I would argue, you know, how many of you 20, 30 years ago thought you would be sitting in some of the successful positions you're sitting in now? Like 20, 30 years ago, I gave my parents a run for their money. If you had told them I'd go off to Yale and get on the faculty there and come on out here to Rhode Island to try to work with all that, mine would be like, no way, I'm going to be bailing her out of jail. But nobody told me that my aspirations were unrealistic. They just sort of stuck next to me, and one step at a time helped me turn it around. So it's just, words matter. They really, really matter, okay? When we call someone non-compliant, what does that really mean? What's a different way of framing that? Typically, what are people doing when we call them that? They're not taking their meds. Yeah, or they're not doing what we tell them to do. Right, yeah. Or what we want them to do. Maybe they have an alternative idea. Maybe they feel like the recommendation is not the best fit for them. Okay? But the language choices are important. Again, these are not always a no-go. And the issue is not like one word here or there. The problem is that we tend to wrap all these things together in these sort of narratives, just like the one that I described to you that I often wrote, that I try harder now to back myself out of. And that it makes it very difficult to think about somebody through a strengths-based lens when we're using that kind of language, okay? So we will get you this electronically. This is just a quick snapshot of a much larger kind of, here's a couple pages of words to think about. Here's maybe a different way to think about it. A caveat that I would add, this one is kind of interesting for people who work in addictions or in co-occurring behavioral health. You know, the question has come up, like, well, we are constantly pushing person-first language in this recovery world, so you don't want to call somebody an alcoholic, right? They're a person living with alcoholism. But again, these are not universal rules, and they don't supersede an individual person's preference. Like, my dad is in recovery, and as one of his steps, he identifies as an alcoholic. I'm not going to say, Dad, that's not person first anymore. You got to say, I'm recovering from. So it doesn't, it's just an example. It doesn't supersede what a person's kind of chosen path to recovery or how they want to be identified. Okay? So I'll get you this, but I'm curious, how about additions? Any like pet peeves of words that come up that, have you all had any conversations around words that come up that you want to try to change?
Behavioral.
Yeah, behavioral. I've even used that myself today, and I've heard that. You're right.
But as a definition of a person.
Yeah.
I mean, there are behavioral components of everyone's activities, but
Yep.
when you say, oh, that's behavioral,
Yep.
she's behavioral.
Right, so some of this has to do with the context that it's used in. Yes, in the blue. Yeah, disease. going to be something in it that feels kind of stigmatizing for people. Yeah, in the back.
Write about daily living activities, whether they're receptive to crimes or dependent. That seems so like not really what's going on.
Yeah. So ADLs, we're like positively obsessed with ADLs, and there's a lot we can do as a service system, right, around rehabilitation and skill building. I'm not suggesting it's not necessary, but that whole functioning thing, is that one on here? Yeah. So you kind of have it up here. High functioning versus low functioning. So we may describe a person in they're low functioning in their ADLs. That doesn't tell you anything about how to write a good rehabilitative plan. You need substance in, and then we'll go over there.
Some of the clients are court-ordered to treatment.
Yep.
So I don't know another way of putting that.
Yeah. I don't know. What do folks think? I mean, that is a reality of someone's circumstances sometimes. Any thoughts on that one?
Legal motivation.
Yeah. They motivation to resolve their legal issues. They're externally motivated. You were going to say, yes. Oh, yes. Yep. Manipulative, gaming the system. Yep. Trying to get their needs met, typically, right?
When a client doesn't want to sign into your plan and it's this big box and you have your client refuse to sign.
Yeah. So a lot of times at the end you have the obligatory sign here, and if a person doesn't, sometimes maybe with good reason, the one acknowledgement is they refuse to sign it without context or that. It may be the reality that they did refuse to sign it, but there could be contextual stuff underneath that needs to be added.
The word denies.
Denies.
I always feel like they're lying. Like,
Yep. Denial. Yep.
I've had situations where I always use the word client. There are some issues around using a person. It's an incredibly different experience when you use the person's name.
Yeah,
And
definitely.
It just is, as a clinic,
Yep.
writing about
Yeah.
it's just
And even the name. Some people prefer their first name. Some people be referred to as Mr. or Mrs. or Doctor or you name it. Okay. Good. This is a great conversation. Again, this isn't meant to like sort of call anybody out on the language. Like looking up on that list, like if there's a bunch of stuff that's in your daily lexicon, it's not intended to make you feel bad. It's just intended to make all of us aware that we have kind of some of these habits that kind of get built in to our verbal and written language, and just to offer you maybe some different ways of thinking about them. Okay. All right, let me, in the time we have left, we've been kind of going back and forth a little bit, previewing the documentation. I want to say a bit more about some of the nuts and bolts of that, and leave you with a couple of examples, just so that you have a sense, and some of you will be involved in this. This is intended to be sort of your speed dating version of person-centered recovery planning, like a big overview, a little bit of all the pieces. There's going to be a group of your supervisors and team leaders at each of your agencies that's going to have an opportunity to do more in-depth, actual concrete skills building. And we're going to do some good practice together and that kind of thing. So know this is more of an overview and more is coming support, okay? So how do we include enough information to create that, individualized, complete view of the person, but do that while still meeting all of that myriad of regulatory requirements? And how do we do that without creating plans that look like this, like so incredibly detailed that no one can read them, they're impossible for us to write? And how do you do it in a way that balances this constant tension that we recognize we're all in, which is that, on the right, our heart and our values are telling us to be collaborative and strengths-based and partner, but on the left, we are kind of really getting squeezed, feeling all this pressure around compliance, medical necessity, policy, documentation, etc. Okay? So let's talk about tricks in the documentation for how you weave those things together in a good plan. So we'll take a look at actual recovery plans in a second, and the elements, goals, objectives, interventions. But I have to at least say for this group, just remember the plan is only as good as the assessment it is based on. And so there will be conversations that continue to happen here in this system and in that more intensive training around what good person-centered assessment looks like as a foundation for a good person-centered plan, okay? A couple of things that are enhanced in person-centered assessment. This doesn't mean they're the only things that are in there, but in addition to all the other rich information you collect, we think a lot in person-centered assessment, much more so deeper dive into strengths and interests as a motivating driver in the plan. We think a lot about cultural preferences and identity and how that might impact a person's experience of their illness, of their preferences in care. Somebody mentioned meeting the person where they're at earlier. So stage of change is certainly relevant in this. I have mixed feelings about stage of change because I've seen it be misused, to be honest. But as it relates to recovery planning, what I want you to remember about stage of change is that for every person that comes into a system, kid, adult, it's typically they walk out and then we think about, here's all the problems, here's what we can offer them. Go here, go there, do this, do that. Okay? Is everybody ready to go here, go there, do this, do that? They're not. But then if they don't show up to all those things, we don't say, our plan really wasn't matched to their stage of change. They're really non-compliant. Maybe we should put them on an ACT team, assign a higher level of care. I'm making the point that the vast majority of treatment plans in America get written as if everybody's at what stage of change? Action or maintenance oriented. And that's not always the case, right? So we have to sort of dial back and maybe start with more modest goals and objectives, and I'll try to offer some examples in there. Very importantly, person-centered assessment involves trying to get to a deeper understanding of the person before you write the plan. It's about going beyond the data and the facts and trying to ask what I call the why question. So let me give you a couple of examples of that. You know how at the end of the assessment, however many pages, 5, 20, whatever, there's usually a narrative box to put some kind of psychosocial summary assessment together. So I will read countless assessments. I got pages and pages of data about how many times they were hospitalized, why, what precipitated it. Then I get to the summary. It says patient is a 14-year-old girl who has been repeatedly hospitalized due to med noncompliance. But yet you've told me that 10 times in the first 10 pages. So the question you have to ask yourself before you write the plan is what? It's why is she choosing not to use medications? Because think about this. If you can't answer that why question, you can't co-create a good plan. So what are some of the reasons people choose not to use meds?
They don't feel they have a mental illness.
So they don't feel they have a mental illness. And in fact, not only do I not need them, I think they're poison. So you can prescribe and hope they're going to be compliant, but maybe a person needs some more basic education and engagement. Maybe they'd be willing to have a cup of coffee with a peer specialist about their decision-making process to take or not take. Or maybe they need to talk about the stigma of it. That would be a more realistic, right? What else? Why else don't people? Right here.
Side effects?
So side effects, right? What if I can't be intimate with my partner? Well, maybe we invite in the partner for some kind of a family session. Or maybe I'm gaining weight, so we involve a nutritionist or a nurse on the team. How do we offset all that weight gain?
A lot of times, because we're working with kids, it's about the parents having to remember
Yeah.
to tell the kid, and a lot of times some of them will think it's an adolescent, I should have to do that.
Yep.
And then we get kind of this power struggle
Yeah.
between the adolescent and the parent.
So you get power struggles within families, and maybe you can develop some systems that could, teens these days, if I need my teenager to do something, he sets auto reminders on his
I had
phone.
a client that wanted to make a point, and she was saying that she was taking her medication. Her mom started to report that she was doing better, and it was all to make a point of, I haven't been taking this med at all.
I proved to you. Right. So that may beg some family therapy for that group. It may beg some very practical, like I said, some teenage, I think maybe I do need it and I am benefiting from it, but I forget and mom doesn't want to remind me, so I'm going to text myself auto alerts.
I don't want to dampen my emotional experience.
I don't want to dampen my emotional experience. I'm an artist, and when I'm experiencing mania, that's when, right? But again, remember, our cost-benefit analysis versus the person's, and we have to have that back and forth.
The symptoms may be all that
Yeah.
fear attached.
I've had people actually say to me, I'm going to be lonely without the voices. Right? It may be all I know. So maybe we talk about, so how do we build connection into your life? How about money, people? It's like we choose the copay or food on the table. Then you get the rep payee or the financial management folks about culture, religion. My culture tells me that maybe we interface with somebody from a faith or an indigenous community.
You don't trust the skin.
I don't have any trust in you to go along with this recommendation. Yeah. Yep. So I hope what you're seeing, every single one of those answers to the why question begs a completely different intervention on the plan. That's good person-centered planning, but it's based on a person-centered assessment. So cultural elements, to come back to the cultural, critical nature of the cultural, assessments sometimes collect data and they stay at the surface. My most powerful learning experience in doing this was with an adolescent female who had been hospitalized. I did some work in the state hospital system in Texas. And she had been going through some bullying in school, and she had developed depression and had been repeatedly kind of going in and out of the hospital and so forth. And her family was very involved, and they were loving, and they were trying to protect her from this, and they kept moving her from school to school. She was about 14, I think. She was Mexican-American, very devout Catholic family. So she was using the CBT. She was complying with the follow-up and the medication. Her parents were very supportive. They were trying to work on the school environment. Kept landing back in the hospital. What ends up happening, they're not asking the why question. So what ends up happening is that she's a 14-year-old Mexican-American female who's questioning her sexual identity. She lives in a very devout Catholic Mexican family with very different level of acculturation. And her parents were very loving, but they were really struggling with this, and she was feeling shamed and shunned by her faith family and by her own biological family. And you could give her all the CBT and meds in the world, but if you don't start unpacking that in a good person-centered plan, she's going to keep coming back to the hospital. So that assessment and understanding as a foundation for the plan is really where you get the most bang for your buck. So we'll talk more about that in the smaller group training that I do. I put some of the examples in here. But let me end in the time we have left, walk through these big picture elements of the plan. We've done a little bit of this as we've gone and with Mr. Gonzalez. But the distinctions between a person-centered plan and a traditional method of documenting is that traditional treatment plans at the top typically start with what list? Diagnosis, problem list, etc. Okay? Problems don't go away like we were saying in the Mr. Gonzalez example, but you want to have the plan be driven by the goal statement. Ideally, in the person's own words, life role vision. It may be 5 years down the road, it may be 6 months down the road, but something that's motivating to them beyond the management just of the clinical issue, the addiction. Okay. Strengths to draw upon, barriers that get in the way. I'll give you a quick tip about those SMART short-term objectives that allow you to do the scaffolding that we're talking about. I have very high expectations around the rigor of how those are written. Typically, systems that I work with who go into this very concerned about their compliance, and they think we're going to do all the recovery, person-centered, fuzzy stuff with Janice, they typically end up coming out better in their audits because the rigor is important too. What you see here is that in the who is going to help the person reach their short and their long-term goals, yes, all of you professional folks, but also an action step for the person in recovery, the client, the adult, the child, as well as any family or natural supporters, okay? So the goals and the vision, again, they're not limited just to the treatment and rehabilitation and the control of the clinical stuff. They're bigger picture, and they're typically focused on this kind of stuff. Just go back to what you wrote down on your list of top 3 this morning, okay? They're most often longer term, more life role oriented. They're quotes. Ideally, you want them written in positive terms. sometimes even the people that you're serving, of course, they're stuck too, and they have their own habits. I just want to be less depressed. But ideally, you want the goal to be about where you're moving toward, not what you're moving away from. So what's the question that you ask them to maybe get to a more refined goal statement? Yeah, what would that look like for you? If you woke up tomorrow and you weren't so depressed, what would you be doing differently? Oh, I'd take my baby to kindergarten, and maybe I'd read in her class on Fridays again. That's the goal for the plan. And then you're going to target underneath that those symptoms, maybe addictions-related issues, things that are getting in the way of their ability to do that, okay? So let me show you this. I'm going to show you this quick video clip because we just have the 2 examples of the plan to end with, and I think you'll really like this one. This is going to show you the difference between, when you think about the goal statement, the difference between focusing on the problems versus focusing on what's particularly important to the person. Oh. We have my PowerPoint up for some reason and not my... Sorry. Let's see if this works. All right. I was on the fence anyhow, and apparently a technical issue is making the decision for me that we're going to forego it. If I have time, I'll show it at the end. This is a fantastic video, though, that's very well done and produced. It's a YouTube-based video. The link will be in there when you get it. If we don't get to it by the end of the technical issue, I just really encourage you to check it out. Generate some great, great conversation around the focus and the planning. All right. Let me see where I am here. All right. Okay. So your short-term objectives. How many of you think these are the hardest part of the plan to write? What is going on here? It is, except it won't. I'm just going to shut everything and reopen it. So the short-term, oh, there we go. We're back in action. So the short-term objectives, typically people will tell me that those are often the hardest part of the plan to write. From a technical perspective, they are probably subject to more of the technical criteria than any other aspect of the plan. So many of you have probably heard of that SMART criteria, okay? Simpler, specific, measurable, attainable. I use relevant. Some people will say realistic, and time framed. But if that doesn't work for you, I often say, just kind of ask yourself, read the objective out loud. And when you read that objective out loud, at the end of the time frame, a month, 3 months, if you can't definitively say, yes, it was met, or no, it was not, without disagreeing amongst each other, it's too soft on the front end. And you got to kind of tighten it up. I'll give you a couple of examples. Objectives are a really critical part of the plan because they send the message to the person, like we did with Mr. Gonzalez, that we think your life can be different in a meaningful, concrete way in a short period of time. 1 month, 3 months. So it gives people what I say is kind of like the fuel of their recovery. It sends a hopeful message. And then we ask ourselves, we know the big term picture. We know strengths and barriers that we have to leverage and address. We may know our first couple of short-term objectives. And then interventions and action steps. Remember, those are a combination of what you do, what the person does, and what folks in their circle do, okay? So let me give you an adult and a kid example, and then we should still have a couple minutes for questions. So this is based off of a real experience that I had a number of years ago. So Jerry had disorganized schizophrenia. He had basically lived in the state hospital. He was in a 24/7 group home. He basically only came out of the group home to come see me once a week for therapy. Okay? He's very lonely, used to go to the jazz festivals, meet lots of people, was saying he kind of felt like a zombie. Wasn't getting out of the house to do much of anything. It's kind of unclear. Was it negative symptoms of schizophrenia? Was it zombie effect? Was he struggling with medication side effects? Really very much wanted a girlfriend, but was terrified to go out alone. Hasn't had one in 10 years, doesn't know where to start. He was unable to take the bus, afraid to go anywhere alone because he often gets confused or fears other might try to actually hurt him. At one point when he was out of the state hospital, he got on a city bus to go downtown, and there were many seats on the bus, and a passenger got on and chose to sit next to him. And through his lens of his experience, he interpreted that as a threat. He didn't lash out at the individual. He jumped off the city bus before it had come to a stop and had like a compound fracture to his leg. So I share that level of detail. Remember we said before, nobody is too sick to benefit from person-centered planning. He was someone who had really struggled with very intense symptoms. But we worked hard together around this goal, what was important to him. So if you had to pick 1 through 4, what do you think the goal for Jerry's recovery plan might be? What do you think? Some volunteers. I just want to be happy. You could hear him saying that. It's an I statement. It's positive. What's the one issue with that one, though, that you think? Anybody have an idea of why that one may not be the best answer? It's a little bit vague. Like you kind of don't know where that's going. Yeah. So, well, what would make you happy, Jerry? I want a date on a Saturday night. I want a girlfriend. So the irony of this at the time, like, I couldn't find my own husband, let alone find him a girlfriend. I'm like a young clinical psychologist. Like, what am I going to do? He wanted a girlfriend. Okay. This is on the right trail, but you want to have a sense of the direction that you're going in, what you're going to be working toward. This is a service. Participation in services is not a life goal. It's maybe a means to get there. This is narrow and clinically focused, and maybe we target that in the short-term objective. And again, this was more, what am I trying to get rid of? If I didn't feel like a zombie, what would I be doing? I would maybe be dating, okay? So, this is what it ended up looking like. I want a girlfriend, somebody to share my life with. He was very motivated to reduce social isolation. He had identified strengths and interests. He loved Chinese restaurants. He loved music. Very well liked, funny guy. But he had a range of needs and barriers that were getting in the way. He had intrusive thoughts. He had paranoia, which would spike in social situations. He would acknowledge that when he was doing well. He used language like that. He understood that. He would get easily disorganized. That made it hard for him to get around the community. He would openly admit that he struggled to attend to his personal self-care and hygiene, okay? So all of these things could interfere with him getting a girlfriend. They're also related to functional impairments associated with his experience of mental health. So there's the connection there. You have your medical necessity, but also if you're not putting your best foot forward, you're not necessarily going to get a date. If you are so distracted in your conversations and you're repeating or obsessing around, he loved Chinese food, but he would get in a social conversation and he would continuously just come back to that, and so he wouldn't make space for the other person in a conversation. Made social stuff hard. So that's a social skill he has to use. So anyhow, we started, he was going to use coping skills to manage distressing symptoms, to participate in a minimum of 1 preferred social activity per week for the next 90 days. Because remember, he'd only been coming to the center to see May. And he would go to the social skills group, right, that we had there. But, it's like he's seen the same 5 women in social skills group that he sees in Closwell Clinic for the last 5 years, or at the clubhouse. He's like, he had gotten smitten with a lady downtown at the Dunkin' Donuts at the cash register, right? So that's what we were actually working toward, was getting him to take the bus. Again, he has to be organized enough to do that. He needs some support around that. You have to get there, you have to be looking your best. Maybe you have an objective also around better managing your self-care and hygiene. Maybe you have an objective about being able to demonstrate starting a conversation with her when you get to the Dunkin' Donuts, okay? So all ways that you can build those things into the plan. For him, He had some CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy. You know who's doing it, what they're doing, on what schedule, and for what reason. So they did a lot of work around thought stopping, distraction techniques, deep breathing, visualization. There was some med management in there, some travel training. A peer coordinator was supporting him with that and doing in vivo rehearsing of the coping skills. He was afraid to go alone, remember, but he had a supportive brother, so the brother committed to go with him. And because of that zombie-like state, the doctor was committed to working with him around adjustments, but he asked him to be keeping more of a basic log on his calendar about how he was feeling, like his level of fatigue and energy, okay? So it just gives you a sense of how you're kind of weaving these together. Let me give you a quick tour of a kid's example. I'm cognizant of time here, and I want to make sure that I don't skip over this. So this is really a family-centered plan. We could have a whole conversation, because there are differences, right? Because your sort of unit is the family, not just the child at times. So try to give you ideas for how we pull that together. So Diana Bright, very friendly, 12-year-old girl of Mexican heritage. She's was an accomplished, I don't know if I'm saying this right, folklorico dancer. It's a type of Mexican dancing very appreciated in her culture. She makes friends easily, had been a very good student until recently. Relationship has become strained with mom. She wants her mom to love her. She wants to be seen as a leader with her friends and be respected by her teachers. Peers are very important to her. As a preteen, she was really beginning to deal with kind of understanding the role of being a woman in a Latino family. There were cultural dimensions there. She was managing intense feelings and starting to feel anxious, disappointed, and frustrated. She was starting to have some tantrums and arguments. She had some early relationship and problems in bonding with her mother. There was a trauma component within the story, exacerbated by conflicts between mom and other members of the family. They were trying to figure out issues around attention and impulsivity at home and at school. They were contemplating one of the diagnoses around attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, but they weren't sure. They were going to be looking for some formal testing because, again, there was a trauma component to this, possibly suggesting family therapy, etc. So she's in need of help. She wants to feel confident, have a sense of mastery. She wants to feel personal connections, both within her family, her cultural identity, and with her peers. So in this plan, I'll read this to you again because of the screenshot. She says flat out, I want to be happy and I want to stop fighting with my mother. She might have stopped at happy, but in sort of probing a little further, that means I want to be at peace with my mom. I want my mom to love me. I want to stop fighting with her. She had some barriers around that. The arguing, some increasing behavioral problems in school, possibly underlying depression, mixed with some trauma experiences, anxiety, etc. Lots of strengths that she could draw upon, good relationships with siblings, had some healthy friendships, very connected to her cultural identity, accomplished dancer, lots of things around that. Used to attend church and had a good relationship with her priest. So one of the things that was creating a tremendous amount of conflict that she and her mom were arguing over was around some of the academic performance, okay? So we have here, Diana's gonna do better in school within 3 months as measured by having at least 1 week with 100% completion of homework with a grade of B or better, as reported by her classroom teacher and parents. That was something Diana's mom wanted, but remember, Diana wanted to feel, she'd been a very good student, and she wanted the respect of her teachers again. So this was mutually agreed upon. I know that's not always the case. And certainly it's not always the case that you go for 100% hit rate. You scale it back depending on what makes sense. And then they had a children's specialist doing some parenting class. They had a therapist doing some CBT for Diana and her mom. They had a case manager that was arranging for a pediatric consultation. She was also starting to struggle with bedwetting. They were trying to evaluate, tease out physical component versus mental health origin to that. Then you had natural support in individual action steps. Diana and her mom together working on practice and breathing exercises. Parents using resources in the church community to help them transport and get Diana to those dance classes that were such an important part of her self-esteem. She hadn't been able to get there regularly because they were struggling to juggle work and transportation, so reaching out to people in that faith community for some help with that to make sure she can hang on to it. And then some kind of special time, quality time, really dedicated for Diana and her mom to be spending some time together here. So again, just wanted to show you those last few examples. So I'm trying to illustrate how these things kind of come together in the creation of one plan without neglecting the clinical issues. And I want to tell you, before I stop, coming back full circle to this morning, my opening comments, one of the biggest dilemmas is this method of planning makes sense to me. I think I'm already doing it, or with some little bit of help and technical assistance, I can write my plans this way, but I can't make it work in my electronic health record or my template. So you get the whole square peg in the round hole dilemma here. And really just want to tell you the most exciting thing that is happening, I think, is that the template that is currently being designed, it's not totally finalized yet, it really does follow the flow, by and large, of that goal-driven, strengths-based recovery plan that we've been talking about all morning, okay? It starts with the recovery goal. It prompts and allows both for input from the service user, the client, but also staff comments, right? Because someone was saying earlier, but like, what if you don't agree? Do you put it in, not put it in? This is a structure that's going to really remind you that it's a partnership and there's space for both perspectives. It has the strengths and the barriers. There's a balance between them. There's lots of nice prompts that are going to be built into it, so it will remind you, like, what's the qualities of a well-written objective? What are some tips for how you write a good recovery goal, okay? And then just moving on to, you've got your interventions. Your interventions will prompt you and remind you. You may not have a natural support in every single plan. Maybe a person chooses not to have anyone else involved. Maybe there is not a self-directed action for a client in every single plan, but the structure of the plan will remind you it's not just about what you do as professionals, it's about building that network and that self-activation and empowerment. So those prompts are in there really just to kind of maximize the participation. So this is, again, it's not finalized. But by and large, to the extent that I've had previews of it myself, I think you're going to find it to be really conducive to this method of planning. So I am going to stop there because I realize this was a complete whirlwind and I went through a lot of material, but I wanted to make sure I got through the examples because a lot of people say they tend to kind of bring things together, okay? So I'm going to stop. I'm going to kind of hang around. Or is there any, some of you will probably have to scooch up and go, I understand that. Please keep in mind that, again, this was an overview, and there's going to be more intensive training and support and tools, concrete tools, offered especially to those of you who are supervisors. But I'm happy to stick around and answer if there's a particular question somebody wants to ask.
Thank you.
You're welcome. You guys were a terrific audience. I really appreciate you.